Okay, thank you. So let me say just a couple things about, what we're talking about, of course, is fostering internal motivation. And I want to make a distinction here. It's one of the first things I have on my list of things to accomplish is to make a distinction between, this term here, internal motivation, but then we have extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And so just to kind of start, well, actually, let's go to the next slide, Rosalia. Because that's the first goal there on the list of goals, is to distinguish intrinsic from extrinsic motivation. And the best way to do that is to kind of say that we'll start with intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation, the way most people define it, it's really saying that these are things that I do because I love to do them. I do them for the complete enjoyment. There is nothing else that I want, nothing else that I need. And we all have things that we are intrinsically motivated by. We have, and what's different, what's intrinsically motivating to me is different from what's intrinsically motivating to you. And if you're sitting next to someone, what is intrinsically motivating to that person who's sitting next to you is almost for sure different than what's intrinsically motivated for you, for the other person. So we're all different in terms of those things, but it's intrinsic motivation are those things that we do for the pure enjoyment of doing them. Nobody needs to tell us to do them. We want to do them, so forth. And there's more than one thing that we're normally intrinsically motivated for, of course, also, but we have our big intrinsic motivators and our smaller intrinsic motivators. I was just talking before the webinar, and when I was 15 or 16 or 17 years old, the big thing that really interested me, it was intrinsically motivating to me, is I wanted to learn Spanish. That's all I really wanted to do, or at least that was the number one thing that I wanted to do at that age. I had other things. I've always been interested in puzzles and so forth, if they're at the right level and so forth. But it was learning language. My brother was a golfer. And my brother loved golf, and we had golf in my family. My father was a good golfer, and my uncle was a professional golfer, and my brother became a professional golfer. It just never interested me that much. I tried to play, but that was something that intrinsically motivated him, and I had other things that intrinsically motivated me. So that's basically intrinsic motivation. The point I want to make about extrinsic motivation is that people usually tend to look upon intrinsic motivation as one kind and extrinsic motivation as another kind. But the realization is that there are a bunch of different degrees of extrinsic motivation. And the point I'm making here is in giving the title of this webinar as internalizing motivation, making it more internal. That's really, I think, what we want to aim at doing in the work that we're doing with character and the work we're doing as educators. So I'm going to use the word internalization, but when we talk about internalization, we're going closer and closer to what's called intrinsic motivation without really being able to get there. And I think I can maybe explain that as time goes on. So let's, the other goals here, I want to explain the long-term and short-term roles that rewards play in motivation. I know that rewards and extrinsic motivators, extrinsic motivation has been a big part of your culture, and it's a big part of culture in schools, around the world, probably. I certainly know that it is here. And I work in 2 elementary schools. One of the reasons why we had to do this on a Thursday or on a Wednesday is because Mondays and Tuesdays all day I'm working in one elementary school, and Thursday I work in other elementary school. And those schools are, as much as I'm struggling with them to try to do away with the rewards that they want to give to kids for being good, it's very hard to do that because teachers just, I want to do that. I think I need to do that. I don't think I can be effective without doing that. But there are benefits to rewards, and there are costs to rewards. And so I just want to say something about that. I'm going to come back to that in a second. The third check mark on the left-hand side of your screen there is I want to share some research on how educators can make student motivation more intrinsic, more internal. That's the point. That's the real, I think, is the real point of doing a webinar like this in the first place, and that's what I hope that you'll be able to leave with. I want to explain the academic benefits and the character benefits of internalized motivation, and I'm going to do that right now. The benefits are basically exactly the same. The thing is, if you work on internalizing motivation, according to what some of the research that I'm going to show you as we go through this webinar, There are academic benefits that will come from your students, and there are character benefits that will come from your students too. It's a win, 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 win. Everybody's a winner. And there is very little that you could even start to consider negative from doing that. But kids, when we treat kids the right way, the point of this is when they're treated the right way, they want to be better students, and they want to be better human beings. They want to be more sensitive to others, more caring about others, more pro-social. So the two are greatly overlapping, and they really are aiming in the same direction. And then the last part of this, I'll offer a half dozen ways that educators can foster better motivation in students. And these aren't things that I just kind of made up for this webinar. They're taken from from research that's been done on 4 different continents. It's pretty well known. It's pretty well researched. It's pretty well known as effective by researchers. And so I want to introduce you to some of those and the ones that might be the most promising for you to use with your students. So let's go to the next slide then. I'm going to start with a man whose name is Edward Deci, who you'll see on another slide coming up here. But Edward Deci was in the early 1970s. He was a university researcher, and he had been reading some of the writings of a man whose name is Richard Descharmes. And Richard Descharmes is pretty well known for writing about what's called origins and pawns. There are some things that we do where we feel like we're the ones who are really initiating that behavior, initiating our actions. And sometimes we feel like things that we're doing are really initiated by others. They're things that other people make us do, or that we have to do because of somebody else's desires or somebody else's, whatever. And the realization was that if we feel like we're origins of our actions, if they're coming from inside us, we feel better about the actions. And when we feel like we're pawns, that we don't feel as good about the actions, and we don't perform the actions quite as well either. And Edward Deci was interested in this concept, and he started he really started to become known by an experiment that perplexed some of the people that that were well known in the field of motivation at the time. And go to the next slide, and I'll give you a sense of what he was doing there. So these the cubes that you see here, there are 2 different sets of them, but this is something called it's called a soma cube, and it's just a puzzle. The puzzle is, the colors are different from one of the illustrations to the other, but they're basically the same shapes. What happens is you can take those things in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and you can put them together into a cube like the one on the bottom of the screen in the center there. It's not easy to do. I've played with soma cubes before. I don't know if I've ever constructed one completely or not, but anyway, it's a long time since I've actually seen one. But they're kind of a nice puzzle, and a lot of people like to play with those puzzles. And the experiment that he did is he took college students, because most of those people do pick college students because they work in universities, and it's easy to find psychology students especially who can't pass the course unless they volunteer to be subjects for some of your experiments. But what he did is he had a bunch of college students who were the volunteers for his experiment, and they filmed these college students one by one. They were kind of sitting in a room, and the experimenter Deci would kind of explain what the soma cube was all about, and say, I'd like to have you try it and just kind of see if you can put that together and I forget how much time. Maybe they gave them 10 minutes, and so they would have this person do that, and then he'd say, okay, I need to take a little break here, but I'll be back in 3 minutes, and then we'll do set part 2 of this. And so he'd be gone for 3 minutes. So while he was gone, they had behind a one-way mirror, they were filming these people to see how much time they would spend, if they would spend working on the soma cube, or if they would spend time doing one of the other things that was available to them. There were some magazines at the table there and a couple other things they could do, but they really wanted to see how much time these people would spend continuing to work on the soma cube. And then he would come in and they would do another experiment with it and so forth. And then that was the end of the day. Then there was a second time that they pulled the same subjects to come back and work with the soma cubes. And this time what they did is that they had them divided into 2 groups, I think it was, for this one. But in one group, they said, we're going to give you a certain amount of money for each each time you can construct it in a 20-minute period. And so they would, give them time to do that, and they would kind of give them, the points that they needed, and then pay them at the end. And the other group, they would come in and say, we want to work, like to just kind of have you work for 20 minutes on that Soma Cube today. And there was no mention of any kind of rewards whatsoever. And then they had them come back a third time. And the third time that they came back, they did not offer anybody any rewards. And it was constructed like basically the first time, where they would have them work on it for a little while, and then they would say, listen, we're going to take a little break here. I'll be back in just a few minutes. You can work on the cube, or you can read the magazines, or you can do any of these other things that are available here. And then they would give them the time, and then he came back after a certain amount of time. And meanwhile, these people were being filmed behind the one-way mirror. And the result of the experiment was that the people who had been paid to get the Soma to work the Soma Cube correctly, when they came back for the third time and they weren't being paid, there was a statistical difference between their interest in working on the Soma Cube and those that had not been paid on the, for the Soma Cube the first time. In other words, the people who were not paid with the Soma Cube kind of were interested in playing with it while on their free time. The people that were being paid, since they weren't going to be paid anymore, they apparently, for that reason anyway, they had less interest in doing that. So, his finding, and that's what's in the yellow box there on your screen, basically the results were offering tangible rewards for behavior diminished the intrinsic motivation for that behavior, was his conclusion in this particular experiment. And not everybody liked to hear that, because it didn't make sense to a lot of motivation researchers at the time, but those are the results that he found. So let's go to the next slide. This is 2 years later, and Mark Lepper and David Green were researchers at Stanford University in the psychology department, and they had a colleague, Richard Nisbett. I'm not sure what role Richard Nisbett played in this. He might have come to visit them or something. But these guys had known about DC's research, and they thought, I wonder if that, if that works with kids. And they had access to children who were between the ages of 24, I think it was, and no, it wasn't. It was 30 and 46 months, I guess, if I remember. So it was something about, from 2.5 until about 3.5, almost 4 years old, who were in this preschool on the Stanford campus. And these kids, before their kind of preschool day started, or early on in the preschool day, there were a bunch of different tables that they could work at with different activities. And at one of the tables during a certain amount of time, there were these art projects. They had these colored markers, and they had nice white paper for them to work on. And so the researchers spent a certain amount of time over a period of days looking to see which kids were most interested in doing this and just doing art projects, with those kinds of things, because there were other things that they could go to. So they were, they made this assumption that these are kids who were intrinsically motivated for doing art, because that's where they gravitated when they had a chance to do that. Then they divided these kids into 3 groups. So these little, preschool kids, and what they did with one group was that they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you, we want to watch you do some beautiful artworks for us. And if they're really beautiful, we're going to give you this nice certificate with this big gold star on it and a red ribbon on it. And the second group of the same number of children, they didn't tell them that they were going to do anything for them. And the third group, they didn't tell them they were going to do anything for them, but they watched the children do their art projects in these 3 different groups. Okay. Then they brought the kids back. Now, what they had done with after this first time was the kids who were promised a reward were given this nice certificate with their name on it, and it had the gold star, a big gold star, and it had the red ribbon. There was, in a second group where nobody had said anything about giving them a reward, what they did with these kids is that at the end of it, they said, wow, you guys did such a great job. We're going to give you this wonderful certificate with this red ribbon and this reward. It was so nice, that you did that. You did a great job on that. And then the third group, they did nothing with. They just, they just said, thanks for being here, and see you later. Then what they did after that was that particular art table was no longer offered for a couple of weeks in the kindergarten class or in the preschool classroom. But a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks later, they brought the art table back, and from behind the one-way mirror, leper in green, at least, I don't know if Nisbet was there, but then they watched the children and they coded the amount of which children and the amount of time that the children spent on working with the art tables. And the children who had been promised the reward for the first time did not get the rewards, were less interested in doing art now. But the only reason they could think of, the only difference between those 3 groups was that those kids, were going to have to be doing it for free. And the other 2, the ones who had gotten the reward but were not expecting the reward, they played with the art kind of like they did before. And the 3rd group that had no promise of reward and received no reward, they were just like before, just one other opportunity to play that. So they actually, in a sense, felt like they repeated the findings with children much, much younger that DC had found in the first place, that children were less interested in art after receiving certificates and stars when they were promised certificates and stars, and so forth. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is the 3rd example I want to give of this. This one of the things I like about this is because this is probably the youngest that this has been done, but Felix Warnick and Michael Tomasello actually did this in Germany with a bunch of 20 months old. So these are kids who were just barely over a year and a half old. And they had the kids come into this little room with their moms. And at one end of the room, one corner of the room, there was an adult who was working behind a desk and was doing something with a pen and some paper, or was putting some papers into the waste paper basket or things like that. But the adult was on one corner of the room, was busy. And the children were with their mothers at the other corner of the room. And at one point, the adult who's working behind the desk would drop the pen or drop one of the papers so that it fell on the side of the desk where the adult couldn't really get to. And the adult would reach over the desk and try to get it and just couldn't reach quite far enough to get it. And ultimately would get the child's attention. And most of these children were willing to kind of realize that this was an adult who needed some help, and so they would come over and give the adult some help. So they coded the children who were most interested in helping an adult. And then what they did later is then they had these kids come in. It was a different adult, and it was a different task that the adult was working on. But what they had done is that they had shown the child this kind of fun little toy where you throw some cubes into the machine, and it kind of goes down a tube, and it makes some kind of a happy noise when it gets to the bottom of it. And they got kids who were interested in doing that, and the kids got to play with it before they went in for the experimental phase of this thing. So this is something that they really liked to do. It's a fun thing, and it's brightly colored and makes nice noises and so forth. And at this point, what the experimenter did with some of the kids was say, it was like they divided them into half, I think, but or into 3 different groups. If you help me, Tommy, help me do this, I'll give you one of these cubes that you can throw into the toy machine. And so Tommy would come, obviously, and help. And with the other children, they would not ask if they wanted to have any, they would not promise them anything. They just kind of wanted to get some assistance and so forth. And then at the 3rd kind of experimental phase, they would do somewhat like Lepper had done and Green in the first experiment, or the one at Stanford, that they would, kids who had gotten the rewards were less interested in giving help to the adult afterwards, or after they had received the reward. The next time they were come in, if this adult needed help but wasn't going to promise me anything, they were less willing to. There were some of them that did give and some of them that didn't give, but the difference between the groups was significant, that those who had received no rewards continued to be willing to help the adult and interested in helping the adult. And those who had not received the rewards, those who received the rewards and they weren't promised this time, they were less willing to do that. So this is an experiment now. I mean, the DC did his in 1971. Nisbet and Green and Lepper had theirs published in 1973. Those are a long time ago. Tomasello and Warneken is 2008 when it was published in Developmental Psychology with toddlers. But variations of these experiments have been done in several countries, in South America, in North America, in Asia, in the Middle East. And the results are basically the same. And the findings end up telling us that if we offer to children tangible rewards that they expect to receive, it tends to undermine their own intrinsic motivation, if they have any intrinsic motivation in the first place, for engaging in the same behavior. Okay. Now, there's key words here. One is it a tangible reward, and is it an expected reward? Okay. So in other words, giving the certificates to the children who weren't expecting it just as a reward, that seemed to be fine. But it's when we promise kids to do that, that we're going to give you this, we'll do this for you if you do this, that's when it looks like it undermines intrinsic behavior for engaging in certain behaviors. So that's just something I want to point out to you in terms of, I know there are educators that will believe that. There's educators that say, I just don't believe it. There's educators that don't want to believe it, but have to struggle with it anyway. And I'm going to leave that much with you, but these experiments have been done several times, and that the general finding is expected tangible rewards tend to undermine children's motivation for engaging in things. And one of the reasons seems to be that they feel like, in some level, we feel like we are becoming pawns rather than origins, that we are being controlled by other people rather than being in control of our own destiny. So I'm going to come back to that idea, but I just want to kind of, let that sink in, and as we come back to it, incubate. And if you want to ask questions about that, please do as we go on. So let's talk about internalization, because what we're going to do now is separate out. We're going to leave intrinsic motivation to the side. We're going to leave rewards to the side, and I want to show you what is the best thinking of character educators, of people in social emotional learning, of people in positive child development, whatever you want to call it, in terms of how do we deal with this situation. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture of Edward DC, who we talked about with the soma cubes there. He's the one on the right. His colleague, who has been for years now, is a man whose name is Richard Ryan. And they're really the ones who were known for this theory of something called self-determination theory. Self-determination theory, I'm sure that Marvin has talked about it. He mentions it in, I'm sure, some of the readings that you've done there. But self-determination theory is probably the most important and the most researched theory of motivation that's out there right now. The real specialty of self-determination theory is not so much what motivates people, but more in terms of how do we internalize, how do we continue to get people to be interested in things and to get them even more interested in things than they already are. And so these are the people that have done most of the research. This particular article here, Self-Determination Theory and the Facilitation of Intrinsic Motivation, Social Development, and Well-Being, is an article that all of the people with the organization that I work with, Heart of Character, everybody has, it's just a nice key beginning article with a couple of sections that are hard to read for those of us that are educators and not used to scientific language. But this theory is looking, the reason why I had the title of this here is it's looking not just at facilitating intrinsic motivation, but it's also social development. And that's what character is all about, right? We're looking for social development. And there are stacks and stacks and stacks of research on self-determination theory that talk about its benefits for social development and well-being. And well-being, ultimately, I think, is what we're all hoping for our kids in the first place. We say success, but when we talk about success, we want them to be successful, but we really want them to be happy. We want them to feel like they're living the kind of life that they're destined to lead, and that they're being successful in that kind of life and so forth. So anyway, so these are the people that are behind the three things, the three components of self-determination theory that I want to introduce you to in just a second. Okay, next slide. I think this is the slide that I know which one this is. Oh no, this is primed. This is not the slide I thought was going to be here, but it's the one that I put in here because I wanted to do that. I wanted to mention that this, so, you know, Marvin's paradigm here, which you all understand very well, I'm sure now, after the amount of training that you have done with him, this, you know, prioritizing character education, and after you get past that first one, which certainly is a key important thing if you're going to do character education well, but this, the relationships, intrinsic motivation, maybe not so much the modeling, but empowering and developmental pedagogy, those four things there are really what self-determination theory is all about. Okay, so relationships, you can't do character education, you can't do social emotional learning, you can't do positive youth development without relationships, or the extent to which you have good relationships with your kids, with your students, you know, with your children in a family. That's going to determine to a certain extent that. And then intrinsic motivation, that's, you know, that's the word right there, right there. Empowerment is really what we're going to talk about in terms of autonomy. And then developmental pedagogy is basically working on competence is a third concept. So I'm going to come to those concepts and go to the next slide, Vasilia, and then this is the one that I thought we were going to have there. So I want to look at, here's what I want you to look at in terms of looking at these four things here. Pretend like instead of four, there's six of them. There's another one to your left and another one to your right that you can't see. The one to your left that you can't see here is basically where there's no motivation whatsoever. And the one to your right is intrinsic motivation. Okay, so I want you to look at these four on your screen as four different degrees of extrinsic motivation. Okay, so it's not just intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. There really are different degrees of extrinsic motivation. And I want to show you how one is clearly better than another. And there's a progression in these. And I'm hoping that as character educators, you'll give a lot of thought in terms of how can we do this better? Okay, so let's start on the left-hand side there, the yellow one, external regulation. I'm going to show you another illustration of these same four in just a second. It's the very next slide afterwards. But you have, if you're a classroom teacher, you have some kids in your classroom that seem to be motivated primarily, if not exclusively, by rewards and punishments. Why do you study? Why do you do your work? Because if not, I'm going to get in trouble. My parents aren't going to, my parents are going to punish me, or my dad's going to give me, my parents give me, so much money for every good grade I get and whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of elaborate things that parents do with that. Some kids really are motivated to do their work in your class because of the kind of bribes that they might get, or because of some kind of carrots or the sticks that they might be used against them. It's the reward, the punishment, those kinds of things. And that's an external motivator. It does get kids to do things, okay? In that sense, that's rewards, what rewards are doing too, because rewards are trying to avoid the negative punishment, the punishments, but it's working on the positive and trying to get kids to do stuff, okay? It's kind of considered the least healthy, and yet it's still effective manner of motivating kids to do certain things. What I want to say about this one is, and this is one of the goals that we had in the first slide that we saw when we were looking at the goals for the webinar that we're doing here, is that there's long-term rewards and there's short-term rewards. And there's long-term benefits and there's short-term benefits. Is probably the better word for me to use here. But the question is, what do we want our kids to do ultimately? Okay. Do we want, at the end of the day, for character educators, do we want them to behave in certain ways today at school and tomorrow at school? Yeah, we do. Do we want them do we care about that just at school, or is our goal as character educators to have them behaving in certain ways where they're thoughtful to other people 2 years down the line, or 3 years down the line, or 14 years down the line when they're adults and they have their own families and so forth? And I think that most of us as character educators, we want the long-term benefits from what we're doing with kids. Rewards work very well for short-term benefits. But the comments that I made about undermining, and that has been found in the research, undermining intrinsic interest in engaging in those same behaviors, that's where the problem comes. Because if we undermine intrinsic interest, kids are less interested in doing it next year or 2 years down the line or whatever. And in a sense, if we're giving rewards, what it looks like is that we might be very effective in getting kids to study for the test. Or if we have catch them being good stickers or wristbands or whatever, we might be very effective in getting them to perform neat actions when there's an adult present. So the adult might be able to give them the catch them being good sticker or the rewards or the whatever the rewards are anyway. But it doesn't bode well for their interest in doing that later on when there's no more rewards that are available to them. So that's one of the differences. Is it long-term results that we want, or is it short-term results? And the long-term results tend to come better if we use these other things that we're talking about here. So look at the blue one here. This one, it says shame under it. It could say pride also, but this is something that the researchers called introjected regulation. I have other terms for it, but what this is, some of the kids in your classroom, they're not as much motivated by the rewards or the punishments. They reward themselves or they punish themselves by feeling horrible if they do poorly and feeling proud, at least temporarily, if they do well. Okay, these are the kind of kids who are always working because they have to work, because my self-concept is built into my being perceived as a good student. And as long as I can continue to get good grades, people will like me and I'll feel good about myself. But if I ever do something that gets a bad grade, then that's going to be horrible. And these are the kind of kids, especially if you have middle school kids or high school kids, if that kid in a school like yours, because my understanding is that you're some of those top schools that get the top kids. Think about the kid that gets the C- or the D+ or whatever, I don't know how you do your grades there, but the kids that don't get a good grade, that get a failing grade or an almost failing grade or just a mediocre grade when they're supposed to be getting the good grades, some of those kids just melt in puddles. They become completely dysfunctional because all of a sudden I'm no good because of this is what happened. So these are people that they're a little bit more internally motivated than the reward and punishment, but it's not a very healthy internal motivation. If we look at the third one on the screen there are certain kids that are motivated because, this might be useful. Okay. And the example I use it most of the time is, if you have a fourth or fifth grade, frequently it's girls because they're, so many of them are so sensitive, but who just absolutely loves animals, just loves animals. I like kitties and I like doggies and just any animal that's kind of cute. And when I get old, I want to be a vet because I want to take care of animals. And I don't like math very much. Math is really hard. I'm not interested in doing that. And then when that child realizes, if I'm going to be a vet, I'm going to have to need to know some math and some science because I have to, first of all, to get through school. And when I realize that, in figuring out medication for a horse versus medication for a big dog versus medication for a little tiny dog or something like that, there's all kinds of math involved there. And all of a sudden there's a reason for wanting to learn things. This might be useful to me, makes a lot of difference in terms of kids' motivation to learn something. And the fourth one is, even more internal than that, where people might realize it's useful, but they really value it. And I think about, one example of this is people that work for Habitat for Humanity. I've heard, I've seen kids do this. I've seen adults do this too. But why are people working for, people volunteer their time to work for an organization to build houses for poor people. Why would you give up your time to do that? And frequently people do that because, it's something that I value. It's something that I feel good about doing. It makes sense to me. It's useful for the world. So on all kinds of levels, they realize this is something that's really fun to do. I actually, when I think about the work that I do in character education, which is spend a fair amount of time doing, I do it not because I'm intrinsically motivated toward it. I do it because it's something that I realize has a lot of utility. And a lot of the word self is under there because it's things that I value, and that's what makes it, worthwhile to me. So I really love doing it in a way, but it's not the same kind of love as some of the things that I'm intrinsically motivated for. So there's 4 different levels here all of which are considered extrinsic motivation. But as you move from left to right on here, on this, on the screen in front of you, it becomes progressively more kind of feeling like it's more yourself. Let's go to the next slide and I'll kind of continue the same thought. This slide is an adaptation of something that I used as an illustration in a chapter in a book one time. But we have intrinsic motivation at the very center, the little circle kind of in the center of the screen there, and a motivation, which is the word at the top of the screen, is it's kind of out of the question. Those are things that we're not motivated for at all. But the other four things where you say, buy me off, ego protection, this could be useful, and I deeply value this. Those are basically what we just saw in the four things before, in those four little illustrations we're looking at. So buy me off that's rewards and punishment. Yeah, I'll do it if you pay me. I'll do it if I'm going to get a certificate and a big gold star. I'll do it if I'm going to get an extra 40 points. I'll do it if, those kinds of things. Or I'll do it if my dad's going to take the car keys away from me, for the weekend or whatever. But that's the level of motivation there. Ego protection is what I was talking about, when the kids have to do it because they feel guilty or they feel ashamed. If they don't do it, if they're not successful, or they feel pride, that sense is kind of protecting their ego anyway. It's a little bit more internal, but it's not really healthy because you're so dependent upon those feelings. Whereas the utility thing, that's the blue circle there, the blue ring, this could be useful. You know what, I need to know that. It's actually, that I might be able to do something good with this sometime. Yeah, I should learn this. Or the other is, the yellow goldish ring there. I deeply value this is the last, that's the Habitat for Humanity example that I use. So the question reason why I wanted to look at this in terms of these circles is, the question to educators is this: what if there were things that educators could do that could help kids move from one kind of outer ring of motivation into a deeper toward the center ring of motivation? One of the things we know about this is that, and if you think about your own life and what you've been motivated for, what you've been learned to be motivated for, the closer it is to the center, that is to say, the closer it is to where it's useful or where I deeply value this, the faster you learn, the more interested you are in the subject, the deeper you learn it, the happier you are learning it, the longer you remember it. And if we could do things with students that would help them to learn more quickly on their own, remember longer, be happier doing it, isn't that something that you would think that every single educator in your schools and in your country and in the world would know how to do, would want to be doing? Okay. So that's the kind of research that self-determination theory researchers have been working on for the last 40 to 45 years anyway. And that's why I'm going to take, from this point on, I want to get into some of those things that get us down closer to the center there. So next slide. Yes. So I'm going to look at three concepts here. Spend most of the time on autonomy, which we're going to do just in 2 slides here, and then I'm going to come back to it anyway. But the three concepts are autonomy, relationships, and fostering competence. The 3 things that, if we do them right in school, are really transformational in the way schools are. And I know schools that have transformed themselves doing nothing other than working with kids on fostering their sense of autonomy, fostering a sense of relationships, and fostering a sense of competence. Research done over 45 years on 4 different continents, several countries. It's just amazing the amount of research that's been done on this thing, more than any other area of character development. So it's so worth knowing about as character educators, and just as educators interested in academics. If you have educators you work with who don't care about character education, all I want is for my kids to learn history, damn it, those kinds of things. It all applies to them too. And if you're in a normal school, you've got colleagues that are like that. So autonomy. 2 points I want to make about autonomy, and they're the ones on the screen there. It really means 2 things. What it doesn't mean is do whatever you want. And the biggest problem with autonomy is that we tend to misinterpret, or people have different understandings of what the real term really means. In self-determination theory, what autonomy means is it's a sense that I have an appropriate amount of say over what I'm doing. Okay? So in other words, I have a certain amount of control over what I'm doing. I'm an origin rather than somebody else's pawn. Okay? And the other thing is that I value what I'm doing. Okay? So if you just think about the things that you do during the day, if you've got some say over them, and if you value what you're doing, you tend to be pretty happy with it. If you don't value what you're doing and somebody else is making you do it, you usually don't feel as good about it. So the more we can help kids feel like they have some say, and the more we can help kids understand the value in doing things, the more their need for autonomy is filled. Okay? And these three terms, autonomy, relationships, and competence, are not presented as just good ideas. They're presented as basic human needs if we're really going to be performing at our best and at our happiest. And I don't have time to do that with you. I have a couple of things I've done with people in the past to kind of illustrate that better. But these are the two things that are involved in that. Okay, next slide then. How do we do this? Okay, what fosters autonomy? We'll come back to these things, but one is, and probably the most important, I think, is a non-controlling presence. Okay, so in other words, in the way you deal, in the way we deal with children, with colleagues too, okay, if we have the kind of language and the kind of manner where we feel like we're really kind of helping them, not making them, that tends to foster a sense of autonomy. Okay, there's ways that teachers can tell students to do things where they feel pressured to do it, and there's ways teachers can suggest to students that they do something that students perceive as help. The more we can do the latter, the better kids feel about it, the more their need for autonomy is fulfilled. Second check mark, helping students develop their voice. Okay. I'm going to come back to that and we'll say something more about that. But voice basically is feeling like I can be my own person. I can have my own opinions, and it's okay if I have my own opinions. Okay? In some societies, that's okay. In some societies, it's not. In some schools, it's okay. In some schools, it's not. In some classrooms, it's okay. In some classrooms, it's not. We feel better when we feel like, you know what, it's okay if I'm a little different. People still like me. That's all right, you know. Third check mark on this screen, helping to attempt to see difficulties from a student's perspective. So the more our students can perceive us as, you know what, my teacher, doesn't always agree with me, but she's really trying to understand me. She really does care about me enough to try to understand things and see things from my perspective. And at least when we have trouble with a homework assignment and we tell her about it, she might say we still have to do it, but we know that she really is trying to understand from our perspective and understand us. The more we can do that, the more we foster a sense of autonomy. These have been shown in research time after time. Okay. Explanatory rationale, number 4, it's the bottom left-hand part of the screen. That one, what that is really getting at is the second of the things I said about autonomy. One is I feel like I have a say in what I'm doing, and the other is I see some value in it. Explanatory rationale helps kids understand why this is important, why we're doing this. Okay? So there's a difference between presenting the new lesson, for example, in biology class about photosynthesis, and saying, look, this is photosynthesis, it's the next chapter in the book, we're going to learn it. Go for it, and do it. And, most kids have trouble with photosynthesis and understanding what it is and why we have to do it. And it's kind of stupid and it's kind of hard and so forth. But if we can give kids some rationale for, look, you guys, this is why we have to learn this. It's kind of hard. I understand that. But if you can get this down now, it's going to make the next chapter a lot easier to do that. And also, let me give you some examples of how photosynthesis really is important in our lives. And if we can help kids understand why we're studying this, why it might be important, that helps them to put a little bit of value in it. And the more value they see in it, the easier it is to want to study it. So it's one of the big ones for fostering autonomy. Then 3 on the right-hand side, do things that are relevant to students' lives, students' interests. Okay, so in other words, if we know that Mark is interested in baseball and he's not interested in mathematics or whatever, and I'm a math teacher, but he's interested in baseball. But Mark, have you ever realized the whole thing about statistics and how important statistics are in terms of baseball? There's every single team has its statistician. They're keeping track of all these things. If we can kind of tie those to what thing we know that Mark is interested in, or the girl is interested in animals and why it might be relevant to animals or whatever, that helps kids to feel like, oh, this is worth learning also. The more choice we can give kids. And then the last one is roles that empower students. And that really is, that's why Marvin's in PRIMED, the pedagogy of empowerment, empowering students. The more we can give them important roles to play, the better it is. Okay, let's go to the next one for relatedness. Okay, here's the thing about relatedness. It's when kids can say, I have somebody I can rely on in times of need. He's there, she's there with constant, unwavering warmth and support. Now, kids don't use that language, but the more kids feel that about their teachers, about their parents, about adults in their lives, and sometimes about peers also, the more they can feel that about people, the stronger the relationships are. Okay, so good relationships are not the people that buy you all the stuff. It's the people that are there for you when there's time, real times of need. And the more kids can trust that adults are there for them, that's when that need is really filled. Richard Ryan, whose photo I showed you back with DC, his comment, I remember in a workshop that he did for us at one point, was saying that probably the most important statement to kind of show the power of relatedness, it's when a kid can say, my teacher likes me. So it's, it's something to think about anyway. Do our kids feel like we like them? Of course I like you isn't enough, it's the kid's perception that's important. Next slide. How do we do relatedness? What fosters relatedness? Okay? And I got 4 checks here. There's a bunch of things, certainly, but taking interest in students' lives, trying to learn about them, what they're interested in, those kinds of things. Not prying, of course, respecting that, whatever. But kids feel like, I care about what you're doing. I'm interested in what you're doing. Oh, you're on a dance thing? Oh, that is so cool that you're doing you're on that dance team or whatever. It's, trying to learn more about them and letting them know that we care about them, that we're interested. Responsiveness to needs. Okay, this doesn't mean responsiveness to what kids want. It's responsiveness to what kids need. And, certainly safety, security, all those kinds of things, if we care about those things. But I'm talking also about responsiveness to the need for autonomy, need for competence, and so forth. But just looking at kids and saying, okay, so something's going on here. What does he need? Some kids need an arm around the shoulder and some comfort. Some kids need to be left alone for a little while they get things together. Just looking at kids and trying to get to know them well enough that we can understand them from that perspective. Okay. A third one is eliminating mandatory competition. A lot of teachers use competition. Competition is beautiful. Competition is great, except when it's mandatory. Why? Because mandatory competition, it's to my benefit to keep you from doing anything, right? It's to my benefit to keep you from learning if there's competition for grades in the classroom. It's to my benefit to keep you from winning if we're in a game, especially if it's an important game or whatever. But these are the kind of things where some kids live for these kind of challenges, and we notice those kids. Some kids really do a lot better work when they have this kind of competition. But what we forget is that half the people are winners and half the people are losers. And those that are continually losers just say, I'm not going to do that, I give up. So mandatory competition is great. But if we set up mandatory competition in the classroom, that can get in the way of relatedness, is the point there. And then the last one is teaching skills of relating. We think that kids know how to relate. But they're talking here about how do we really make friends? How do we enter into conversations? How do we leave conversations? How do we solve interpersonal conflicts, things like that? What are the skills that kids need to know? A lot of kids learn them just automatically. Some of our kids in our classrooms, in our schools, don't really know them, and they really need to learn those skills. And we can help them. We can foster better relatedness by helping those kids that need to learn those things, to learn the skills of relatedness. And the third one is competence. And next, yeah. Okay, so competence is really 2 things involved in this too, but they're 2 closely related things anyway. It's when a child says and really feels, I've got the skills to meet the challenges that life will present. Okay. So it's a question of having certain skills under your belt, in your toolbox, wherever we keep our skills. I'm sure if you're, because you're in good schools, you get certain kids that come there that were kind of iffy in terms of whether they were academically prepared to really be in your school to do work at that level. Some of those kids are coming in that don't have the skills to meet the challenges of life, because life at that point is, meet the challenges of school. And those kids are kind of doubly behind if they really don't have the skills. One is they don't have the skills, and second of all is they're feeling like they don't have the skills, and they're feeling, they're kind of suffering because of it. So anything we can do to help kids realize that even if I don't have the skills, I can learn the skills. That's part of it. It's a sense of competence anyway. And self-efficacy is a term of having confidence in one's skills. So some kids have the skills, but they don't have the confidence that they really have the skills. So it's helping kids have a sense of self-efficacy. Not only do I have the skills, but yeah, I know how to use them. Or if I don't have the skills, I could probably learn something like that, I bet. That's a sense of self-efficacy, that you can take care of things for yourself. There's a few examples on the next slide. So optimal challenges are, kids that really need to feel more confident. The best thing we can do as teachers is to give them a chance, give them a challenge that's right there at that level of, it's not too hard, it's not too easy. It's kind of just right where they got to do some work to do it. If we know kids well enough to know where that point is, where it's just barely above your comfort level right now, but you can do it, and we present that challenge. When a kid does that, when we do that, and we're successful, when the kid's successful, wow, I did it, all right. There's that's a sense of self-efficacy, a sense of confidence. And the more kids can have those kind of optimal challenges and meet the challenge, the more that sense of confidence is met. So it's hard to do. I realize that's what differentiated instruction is all about. But the more we can do that, the better it is. So that's related to the next one, which is experience with success. The more success we can set up for our students, the more success they can have. That fosters confidence. Growth mindset. I suspect that most of you have done something with Carol Dweck's book and her concept about, there's growth mindset is, I can learn if I work with strategies, or I continue with, put a lot of effort into things, that I was born with certain capacities, but I really am going to develop if I work on developing those capacities. That's very different from I was born with certain capacities and they're not going to change. So it's helping kids realize that the people who are really successful in life are not the ones that were born as natural athletes or natural scholars or natural artists, but those who really worked at it and worked and worked and worked and worked. Michael Jordan is the one that I think Carol Dweck uses in her book as an example of an athlete who didn't have all the great skills to begin with, but he worked so hard that's how he ended up being one of the greats. And positive performance feedback, which is a kind of feedback, might be best if I send these, I'll send a handout about that. But positive performance feedback is a kind of feedback that doesn't focus on the negative. It focuses on okay. Competence, that's where we were. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. Okay, this is, remember back to those rings that we had where there was the center ring and then there was the other rings in there? So there's three things that research has shown that if you as teacher in an academic subject, or you as character educator in non-academic, in pro-social subjects, if you do three things, what happens is if you go back to think about those rings, if there's three things that you do, your students will move in closer to the center of those circles. And these are the three things. Okay, so it's the slide. If educators use all three of the following strategies, student motivation tends to move toward being more intrinsic. It moves in toward the center of those circles. If educators engage in only one or none of these strategies, motivation tends to develop no farther than ego protection. Okay, ego protection is that second circle where kids feel like they're, that's when it all has to do with pride or shame or guilt if they, perform well or if they don't perform well. And ideally, we want kids to get in closer to where they feel like this is useful or this is really valuable. And if we do these three things that coming up here on the next slides, then kids tend to move in toward the others. So can we does it work to go to the next slide? Uh, okay, so there's two. We saw 3 and 2. Is there a 1? Is there a 1 also? There we go. Okay. First one, provide a meaningful rationale. Okay. That's something that really helps students understand why the behavior is important. Okay. The second one is acknowledging feelings. I realize this is hard. I realize this might be difficult for you. I realize that, this is a really hard concept to do, or I realize that you reaching out to somebody in need like this might be uncomfortable for you. But, okay, so now we're back at meaningful rationale anyway. This is, if we give them a reason for doing it, this is why this is important. This is why we're learning this. This is why the material might be useful. This is how you might use this material. This is how you might use these skills. If you're talking about character development, helping kids understand, why it's important to do it, that helps move toward the center. Number 2 then had to do with acknowledging their feelings. And so acknowledging their feelings is, even if it's hard, I understand, I'm with you. It's trying to take a student's perspective. And can we go then to number 3? Okay, so the number 3 is offer. Yeah. So this is the most important thing here, is whatever choices we can offer, but it's really along with the non-controlling language, so that kids perceive us as being there to help them with information rather than pushing them into doing things. Okay. I'll send this along too if you want. Next slide. I'm sensitive to your time here, and so I want to give you a few things, and this is the last handout that I can also send you that I kind of explain these, but these are a lot of individual things that help, and I won't go through all of these because you'll all have access to these slides. But autonomy support, these are the details. How do we support autonomy? Because really, when it comes down to it, if we want intrinsic motivation, relationships are really important, because kids are motivated more by people who they care about and people who they don't care about them. And the more we can foster their competence, that's important. But what really controls intrinsic motivation more than anything is how much kids feel like they have a say over their actions, and how much they can learn to value why these things might be important. Okay, so here's just a bunch of different individual things. Most of these have been used in research a bunch of times. A couple, are maybe not as research driven, but ask students for input and show respect for what students say. So ask students what they think about things and so forth is important. Listen carefully and compassionately when students express frustration or dislike for an assignment. Okay. Allow students to develop common norms for the classroom, how we want our class to be. It's a great thing to do. You're setting it up from the very beginning. What kind of classroom, how do you guys want to work? What would be best for your learning? And getting a sense from kids, because then they feel like, oh, I've got some control over, I have some say in terms of the way my class runs. A lot of, especially in elementary schools, a lot's been done with this, but in high school too. And I'm sure that Marvin Berkowitz has talked to you guys about Hal Urban, and I know that he's done some exercises from Hal Urban with you. Hal Urban was a master at doing, allowing kids, and having kids take an active role in what kind of class they wanted to have. That's one of the reasons why he was so good. Bottom left-hand side, encourage, facilitate reflection on purpose in students' lives. Once kids feel like they have a purpose in life, all of a sudden they've got a whole bunch of reasons for doing things and getting more involved in them. Right-hand side, help them appreciate and be respectful of opinions not shared with the majority. Allow students to disagree with you. Some teachers hate that, okay? But if we can allow students to disagree, it's very, very healthy. If teachers hate it, it's usually because students disagree in very disrespectful ways. But the problem is not the disagreement. The problem is the disrespect. So we have to teach kids how to disagree respectfully. Then it's very healthy to do that. And we're killing 2 birds with 1 stone if we can teach them how to disagree respectfully. Use restorative practices. Restorative practice is just a great thing for fostering autonomy that we can't go into. And allow students to have meaningful input into grades or evaluations. Some teachers don't want to do that. Some teachers do, but that's another helpful thing too. Next slide. There's another one, explanatory rationale. I don't really need to say much about this because we've done this already, but it's just such an important one for autonomy support because it's really the one that focuses more than anything on value. Explain why learning or doing this is important, why it's helpful, why it relates to something else that you might be interested in. Giving kids a hook for why this might be valuable, that's what builds autonomy. It helps them, when they realize it's valuable, then they have more interest in doing that and choosing to do it on their own. That's why it's autonomy supportive. Next slide, there's student voice. So a whole bunch of ideas for here. And we talked about some of those before. Didn't we just go over that? Yes, let's go to the next slide. Offer choice to the extent possible, okay? And there's all kinds of ways to offer choice, and I always use the example for mathematics. We're really saying, with the example for mathematics is, if kids have to do homework, you say, look, you guys, I want you to do this homework tonight because I really want you to understand this concept. It's really important. And you can do the first half, you can do the last half, you can pick the even numbered problems or the odd numbered problems. You pick the problems, okay? I just want you to get practice in. You don't have to do all of them, but do half of them. That helps kids feel like, oh, I've got some control over which ones I'm going to do anyway. I'm going to pick the easy ones, or some kids say, I'm going to pick the hard ones, but it helps kids to feel like they've got a little say over what they're doing. Let them choose from a menu of topic options. That's when you're writing an essay or choosing a term paper or something like that. Let students pick or a class vote on what they're going to be doing during this period today. Sometimes we can do that. Most of the time we can't, but I just want to offer these in terms of some of these are available to us and others can't. I've had friends who have worked with, and I actually have done it too in classroom, offering options, ways to prove mastery of classroom material. Every once in a while, we can do it without an exam. If you give kids a chance to say, we're going to have an exam on this in 2 weeks, but you know what? In this particular case, if you think you have another way that you can show me you really mastered the material that's not the exam, I'm happy to consider that, with you. Why don't you talk with me about it? And we'll see it. So it gives a little control to kids. For younger kids, options like even now, say you want to take a bath now or in 15 minutes. You got no choice about whether you're taking a bath or not, by the way, or you've got no choice about whether you're taking the exam or not, but sometimes you can offer choices that way. And the next one, please. Okay, so we're at the end there. I mean, I figured that was about as much time as we were going to have for there. I was left with some comments that I want to try to answer as succinctly as I can. And then if there's others, maybe we can do that too, depending on how your time is and so forth. But these are the questions that got passed to me. And a couple of them I went over pieces of, but others I didn't get to do that. Okay, so first of all, the first question that I got was, is this kind of motivation mutually exclusive for character education? And I hope that what I was saying in there that you understood was this system of internalizing motivation, of moving motivation from the very externally regulated to something that comes more from the inside. It affects our interest in being helpful to other people, in being sensitive to other people, and being sensitive to academic stuff too. So it's really for both. It's for all kinds of things. And the research that's been done on it has been in the classroom. It's been in service learning. It's been in people's kind of self-programs for self-improvement, in terms of getting their bodies in shape or other things like that. It really, it's really been applied to all of those things. Second question, when you design a character education curriculum, in which moment should you introduce intrinsic motivation? Okay. So I hope that those things that I'm just talking about there, they really ought to start from the very beginning. These are really things that adults can do to foster intrinsic motivation. And there's very little that students can really do other than it's probably good for us to help them be aware of what's happening and why we think it might be important. But these things ought to be started from the very beginning of the character education program, or as soon as you can get into it and the extent to which you can get into it. Third question, is this kind of motivation, is it more suitable for a certain age or stage of development? This kind of motivation affects kids. I've seen it be used with children as young as kindergarten, and it carries up into people working in businesses and so forth. So anything at least from 4 to 5 years on, certainly is important. One of the things that we realized is that starting at about age 11, 12, and certainly through high school, autonomy, a sense of autonomy becomes more and more and more important. Okay? If we got high school kids who don't feel like they have a sense of autonomy, we got trouble. Those are the kids in your school that are going to look for other ways to get back at you for not giving them any power. So suitable for any age, but there's some slight variations in that, but it's but certainly any age of school anyway.
David,
how can we work? Yes.
Maybe we should open the questions to the people who are here.
Please. Yep. That's great.
To interact with you. So
happy to. Yes.
Anyone has a question or a comment? Why?
Yes, I have a question.
Manu? Is that Manu who said that?
Freddy as well.
Manu and Freddy.
Okay, Manu, go first.
Okay. I was wondering in the different degrees of extrinsic motivation, why is it different degrees of extrinsic motivation and not different degrees of intrinsic? I don't know if my question is clear, because in like the third level from outside to the inside, you already see some intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
So why are,
Yeah, so let me answer it then, but if I don't answer your question correctly, please let me know. So make sure I understood correctly. So those 4 degrees, those 4 steps that we saw, those were all degrees of extrinsic motivation, first of all. They were extrinsic motivation. And the closer you go to the center, that's where you receive, that's where it is intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, what's really different is intrinsic motivation are things we do only because we get joy out of it. And that's that's why we do it. The others are done for other reasons. But the closer we get toward the center, the more internal it becomes. So that's the difference. Is the self-determination researchers say it never becomes completely intrinsic, maybe, but it comes closer and closer and closer to intrinsic motivation the closer it gets to the center, and that's why they call it internalizing motivation rather than making it intrinsic. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
So in a sense, very, very, very internal motivation is very much like intrinsic motivation. But it's like saying, you can become more and more like God, but you can never become God. So God is like the intrinsic motivation, but all we can do is approach that to the extent of our abilities.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
Manu, Fred is the next one.
Okay, David, first, thank you for your time and this wonderful information that you just gave us.
My pleasure.
And I have one very specific question.
Yeah.
In our Colombian culture, the honor roll takes a big part in our education, right? So how can we change this honor roll into something more meaningful? And how can we get parents involved? Because if you see here in Colombia, parents are the ones who are asking for the honor roll. And this is becoming a big competence between all the students, and it's making something not healthy. It's not healthy for us.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you my best example. I try to talk from a research perspective, and I don't know any research about this. So I'm going to apply what I know to what I think your question is. First of all, you probably are not going to change those parents. And second of all, you probably are not going to completely change the culture. But there probably are some things that you can do, little things that you can do to make it a little bit more intrinsically or internally motivated than others. For example, if every day you push kids, remember the honor roll, you got to be working for the honor roll. That's why you're in school, for the honor roll. The more you say that the goal is the honor roll, the more you are helping to perpetuate, that system. However, if your focus instead of that is more on mastering the material, I want you to get inside this material. I want you to own this material. I want you to make this material yours. I want you to become master of this material. And then so that kids are realizing that that's really what's important, is mastering the material. Oh, and the ones that master the material best, they also happen to be made, on the honor roll. So I think it's the more emphasis you put on the honor roll for a goal to work towards, that doesn't help. But the more you can use the honor roll to reward kids, it's nice that, to recognize the kids who really were masters. But I think it's the way you present it is the closest I could come to answering that question. It's healthier if kids learn the material to master it rather than learn only to get their name on a,
David, thank you for your time and thank you for all the insights that you're providing us with tonight.
Thank you. You guys you're all very nice.
No, actually, you're giving us very interesting ideas of how to guide our teachers and how to conduct this in the best way, in a very friendly way, because as you know, it's not everything about students, but it's also the way how we teach these adult people just to lead something like that. So first of all, thank you. Well, actually, my initial question was so related to honor roll, but Freddie stole it from me. But then I would like to go for something that has been always my concern, and something that I've been always questioned about how to get it, how to get like a data. And I'm insistent, how can you measure something like this? I know this is really something that you're expecting from the students to show from actions, but beyond that is, do you have any way or any guide or any orientation for us just to see how we can measure that progress in our students and of course in an adult people as well?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple of questionnaires that you could use. Let me say, it's tricky the way you do that. Some people want to know how they can measure these things in kids so that they can put it on the report card. And I'm not in favor of that. I don't know if Marvin is in favor of that, but I'm not in favor of it. But if what you are wanting to do is to get information about an individual student for the purpose of kind of judging that student, I'm not sure it's such a good idea, or it's easy to do. I'm very much in favor of trying to get that information from students so that we can judge how we're doing as a school. Are we making progress from this year to next year or whatever? And there's a couple of questionnaires. I could send those also if you want. I'll send them to Roselia and she can send them to you. But there's a couple of questionnaires that you could ask students to just put, where they can put a number by, yes, I strongly agree, or I kind of agree, so, I disagree, I strongly disagree, those kind of scales there. And where one of the things, for example, it's my teachers like me. I mentioned that was one of the statements that Richard Ryan says is an important one for belonging. And so if you have a question like, my teachers like me, and 3/4 of your students say, I disagree with that, and 1/4 of them say, I agree, that tells you something about your school. If all of your students, if 90% of the students say, I strongly agree, and 10% say something else, that's very good. So that way, if you do that, you have some numbers, and then you can do another, if you care about working on relationships or working on competence or working on a student's sense of autonomy, you can take a measurement of the student body or of the senior class or some class or whatever, and then work on it as a group of, you as teachers look at it and say, wow, we really need to work on this. We're pretty good on relationships, but we're not very good on autonomy. And if you care, then you work on autonomy, and then you give it to them again 6 months later, or the next year, or 3 months later, just to see if it's different. And there are some already developed scales that you can use, and I can send you that if you want to look at them and use them, if that would be helpful.
Well, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. Yes, I would really appreciate to have tools like that, because definitely something that we are trying to see is the impact of incorporating something like that in our school, and see how students are seeing that, and see how much progress we are making in terms of the strategies and being effective on the things that we want to reach.
Yeah.
So definitely, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you.
Okay. So I think I have 3 things now, or maybe 4 if you remember, Rosalia, but I'm going to send you those scales. I'm going to send you the thinking about positive performance feedback. I'm going to send you that whole list of autonomy. If you remember anything else, make sure I have those written down anyway. So I will send you those. And if you ever have any questions about it, my email address is on the slide here. Me pueden escribir en español o en inglés, como quieran ustedes, pero ustedes ya hablan inglés bien, por eso no hay problema. But anyway, any other questions?
Catalina is back. So
Catalina, oh good.
A question for Catalina, then Maria, and then Rosa. And that, and we.
No, actually, I was gonna ask Kata's question. She wrote me by message, so I was just gonna ask her question. So Kata, if you're back, you want to talk about it?
Oh.
Hello.
Kata, te oímos.
Okay, I'm sorry, I got disconnected somehow. I don't know what happened. My question was related to the way we praise our kids' effort. We do it in public because we think they should be honored, and we correct them. We try to do it in private, but still, my question is, I don't know if we are somehow helping to enhance the gap for those kids who never get to stand out by praising the ones that do. Our intention behind our acts is always good, but somehow I get to think about those who never get to be noticed for some qualities they have. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. So first of all, what you said, the 2 things that you said, we praise in public. Public praise is fine. Public praise it's okay to public praise. When you said we try to correct in private, that's the only way to do it. Please do not ever try to correct in public. That's counterproductive. But the other thing that I'm hearing you say, we have to find all of our kids. We have to find ways.
Sorry, David. Yes. I'm sorry, David. Es importante que todos cierren sus micrófonos para que podamos escuchar a David. Gracias.
Okay. So the last part of that, what you said is really important. We have to find ways to give praise to every single kid as much as we can, and especially those kids who never get the public praise, and if we can find something to do, just to say, you know what, I saw you yesterday, I saw that girl who fell down, as she was running and fell down, and you helped to pick her up. That was so cool. I felt so good just seeing you do that. That was a neat thing to do, to a kid who writes an essay, for your class, and it's kind of an okay essay, and it's not all really, it's not a great essay, but there's a couple of things in it that are really nice, to go to that kid just on one-on-one and say, you know what, there were some things that really, maybe could have been better, but you did a couple things in your essay that I really, really loved, But then at one part where you're talking about the boy and how he went to help that other boy, I loved reading that. It was just so nice the way you did that. Find something good and let the person know. Whatever you can find that's good is is really is so nice. And we can find that about most of our kids. And there's certain kids that are always going to get the public praise, and that's fine. But we really have to be sensitive to those kids that don't get the public praise too, because we all need it.
Okay, Maria is the last one, Maria Teresa, because we are just in time to close the webinar, and we're very happy with all what we learned here. So thank you, David. María, ¿cuál es tu pregunta?
Hi, Rosie. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
No, it was just like trying to support Kata because she wrote us on the private message that she had the trouble with technology and all the questions were solved. But anyways, thank you for this wonderful and amazing interview. I had a lot of note taking. I mean, my hand hurts, but it's gonna be very useful. I'm gonna share it with all my peers. And thank you, David. It was very, very, very significant for us. And I feel that we're in the right track, especially because when you talk a little bit about answering Diana's question related to the questionnaires, we as the school already designed like a questionnaire that we're gonna use that related to all the, like our leadership program with all the character strength, the mindset, but we're gonna make it like self-evaluation for kids. And we're gonna put it like try to doing blended learning, and we're gonna give them like Chromebooks or iPads, and where they're gonna like answer how are they feeling on a scale from 1 to 5 or with happy faces, but all related to this character traits somehow. And at the end, we're going to make like a feedback with all these questions, and we're going to give to parents that report card with the one with the academics. Like it's not something made by teachers, but made by the student, and like are self-evaluating their learning with this SEL competences. But that was like my question and the like a comment for this wonderful half an hour session. An hour and a half, I'm sorry.
That's great, Maria. I think I would, if you feel like it, sometimes send it to me. I would love to see what you have done or what you're doing, what you're working on. I will not steal it, I promise. I just am interested in
David, absolutely.
What people are doing like that. It would be great.
No, I can send it right away. We were just planning this. I work with preschool from pre-K to first grade, and we designed it regarding to, we divide a lot of traits by bimester. So we are trying to evaluate and assess for this bimester in order for them to receive their report cards by March 20, I think, and we're trying to implement it. So right away, I will send it to you. It's with a questionnaire called Question Pro on website, and it's easy. We're gonna try it next week to see how it works.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Rosie and Andre.
Gracias, María. Gracias, Tere. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for being here. And we are going to share this. We record the talk, so we're going to share it with the slides, and we hope more people can watch and enjoy this interview with you. Thank you, David, very much for your openness, and we will talk soon. So
okay, thank you. If you have questions, you know how to reach me. Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.